Hey there, welcome back to another review, this time of the 1982 film Swamp Thing. The comic book legend lives. Swamp Thing is a 1982 film based on the DC comic book of the same name, Swamp Thing. Now, this was the second DC comic character that was adapted on film until Batman in 1989. I mean, you had Batman, the 60s, 1966 movie, so you could say maybe third comic book character, because Batman was adapted before, and I'm just saying like feature film. Like, there had been serials before, with Kirk Allen, the Superman serials, and a few other Batman serials before. But, so mostly though it was Batman and Superman. So really it was the first, you had Shazam as well, but other than Shazam, this was and a few maybe like I think it was I think they were called like the Blackhawks or something. There was like a serial based on a little bit of comics. There's some comics that were in the 40s. But Swamp Thing was the first other really major DC comic superhero that was adapted into on film that wasn't named Batman or Superman, especially feature film. And it's kind of interesting because I'm surprising that this was the one. Because Swamp Thing is kind of it. It seemed like a film that would have been kind of hard to make in 1982, considering the limitations, special effects wise, and unless you had a really big budget, it kind of seemed like it might be a hard film to really pull off. And ultimately, it really is. It still is kind of a hard film to pull off, because the makeup effects on the suit are really not that great. It definitely looks a lot better on comic book or artwork form than it does on film. But I'm still glad they did it, because this is a film that I find it entertaining. It's an entertaining time waster for me. Um, I would not say it's one of Wes's best films. It's not one of my favorite films he's done. But it's just about as enjoyable as, for example, Summer of Fear was for me, and it's another fun, campy B movie. I mean, it's not as full on 100% camp as Return of the Swamp Thing, which, to be honest, I'm actually a bigger fan of. That movie's a serious guilty pleasure of mine, and I will probably take a little short break from Wes Craven reviews just to record and post my review of Return of the Swamp Thing, because I'd actually been wanting to do a review of that for a long time. Um, but Swamp Thing, it's all right. It's an all right film. It's decent for what it is. I look at it as a 1982, early 80s update of 50s B-movie monster movies. That's what I look at it as, for the most part. It's a pulpy, definitely a 50s pulp comic sort of movie. And the film stars Adrienne Barbeau, who she was also in Creepshow the same year, which, strangely enough, had another sort of story that dealt with somebody who gets turned into a plant monster, so to speak. The Lonesome Death of Jordy Verrill. And, of course, the year before, she was in films like Escape from New York, directed by John Carpenter, and The Fog. Those are both films I definitely do like more than Swamp Thing. But Adrienne Barbeau is good in this, though. I like her performance in the film as Alice Cable. Uh, you don't get to see her naughty bits in this Blu-ray, because you weren't meant to see her naughty bits in the first place. What do I mean by naughty bits? You weren't meant to see her titties hanging out. You weren't meant to see other girls' titties hanging out either. But that's what happened when the first MGM release of this film on DVD and VHS was they got a hold of the European version, which has full frontal nudity of Adrienne Barbeau, and some more full frontal nudity in a sequence at Arcane's party. And Swamp Thing is a film that I will always have certain fond memories of, because when I first saw it, I think I was definitely pretty young. I was definitely pretty young. I don't even think I was even in my teens yet. Mom and I, we went to Blockbuster. And I remember this as clear as day. We went to Blockbuster. I went in the family section. I saw Swamp Thing. I was like, hey, I actually want to see that. That looks like it might, I want to check it out. And it was in the family section. Mom saw the rating was PG, so she's all right. I think, though, we should watch it together. I don't want you watching it by yourself. So, we still have the TV too in my mom's bedroom that I used to watch Swamp Thing for the first time on, and we were watching it, and it seemed like things were all right. Things were going all right. Then you get to the scene where Adrienne Barbeau is washing herself off in the swamp, and then it was the infamous European cut. So here I am, like, definitely maybe 8 or 9 or even younger than that, and here I see for the first time ever full frontal nudity, and my mom's like, "What? Hey, that's not. This isn't appropriate. This is PG. What?" And then it was like, "You shouldn't be looking at this." And of course, I was like, "Fuck it, I'm gonna look anyway." And and then it continued in the party scene. I'm like, oh my god! If I knew this, I would not have rented the. Oh, and so I will always remember that memory. It was the first time I ever saw full frontal nudity in a film. It was the first, and it was also the first time I saw Swamp Thing. And then I remember renting it on DVD from the library, and it's the same uncut version. And I watched it then again, and you know. But what's funny is I mainly saw I think yeah, I saw this first before I saw Return of the Swamp Thing. But Return of the Swamp Thing was one of the first DVDs I ever got, because I remember it fondly. My dad bought it for me. And so I didn't really have Swamp Thing until I found the uncut version on VHS at Big Lots. So yeah, I remember that. And I was also with my dad when that happened. But I will always remember that memory of just my first memory of full frontal nudity was from Swamp Thing. And this was I got to see all of Adrienne Barbeau and her awesome rack. And so that was a notorious story, because that DVD and VHS got recalled almost immediately. Such a firestorm of controversy. Parents were all appalled. Oh my goodness! My child saw nipples. Oh! I mean, it's not like she was really completely naked. I don't think she was completely in the buff. I think maybe a little bit. I think I haven't seen the uncut version in forever, so I don't know for sure if you got to see her bush or not. But I know in the party scene, it was just some tits that were hanging out. That's about it. I mean, I never got it anyway. What's the big deal? I mean, men have nipples too. I mean, if I freaking lifted my shirt up right now and showed you my hairy chest and fucking nipples, people would be like, "Ew, it's disgusting." But they wouldn't be like, "Oh my god, that's offensive. You better cover those nipples up. Dear Lord, there's children present." Uh, but it's part of fucking the human body. I don't see the big deal. If it was up to me, I'd be fine with more women walking around topless. The more the merrier, if you know what I mean. But anyway, but but yeah, that was recalled, and this release does not have the nudity, and neither does the other MGM DVD. So, and the main reason why these U.S. releases are not going to have the nudity is because it's in the contract. It's in Adrienne Barbeau's contract. She did not give permission for the U.S. release to include scenes of nudity. So it's the European releases that can get around it, but it's not the United States release. Any version of Swamp Thing released in the U.S. can legally cannot get away with showing sequences of Adrienne Barbeau topless. or full frontal. They can't get away with it. So, yeah. So honestly, I don't know if it was the first memory of full frontal nudity, but it's definitely the first memory of topless nudity. Definitely. But I vaguely remember I did see everything. But that's just, I could be wrong. I haven't seen the scene in a while, and maybe I can refresh my memory later. But anyway, Adrienne Barbeau was great. I also really liked Dick Durock as Swamp Thing. I thought his performance was really fantastic. That was actually really underrated because he really showed a lot of depth and emotion underneath all of that makeup. And it was really rough for him to shoot the film. I mean, he was in the swamps, the Cypress Gardens, California. I think it was somewhere in California. They didn't really film it in the bayou. That's where film takes place, but it's not filmed in the bayou. And it was miserable. It was 103 degrees outside. He's caked in all this makeup and this hot suit, and sweating, and he's sweating so much that his makeup is falling off. So like his lip would fall off. The makeup lip would fall off. They had to put it back on. When he would do the stunts, the shoot would rip, and then they'd have to fix it. And then the humidity. I mean, 103 degrees is bad enough, but then you add the humidity, and then it's just hell. I can only imagine what he went through. But he was a trooper, and he really did a great job of playing Swamp Thing. Ray Wise did a good job too as Alec Holland. I thought he did a good job. A little bit he had to work with. It was actually one of his better acting performances. And he didn't play a bad guy, which was definitely interesting because I'm used to him being a bad guy in like every movie. He was a bad guy in RoboCop. He's a bad guy in all his other movies. So it was nice to see him play a character who's not a villain. And I did like Luis Jordan as Arcane. You could definitely see why the Bond creators thought he'd be a good choice for a villain for a later Bond film. I think it was Octopussy. I don't know for sure, but I think it was Octopussy. And they casted him as a villain in a later Bond film, and he just oozes villainous charisma. You can tell that he's having a good time with the material. But it wasn't a fun shoot for him because before he started shooting, his son had sadly committed suicide. His son had jumped out of the top floor window of a hotel room. So yeah, it was pretty rough for Luis Jordan, but he pushed through and delivered a really good performance. You had David Hess, who's fun to see as one of the henchmen, who was he still a villain, still a bad guy, but at least he wasn't really a, let's say he wasn't raping people and stuff like that. So so that was nice. Yeah, I also had Nicholas Worth, who you might recognize as because he was in Darkman. He was one of Durant's goons named Paulie. He was the fat guy, that got thrown off the top of the building. And that's crazy because he's in two movies that have similar heroes in them. Swamp Thing becomes disfigured. Alec becomes disfigured and turned into Swamp Thing because he's lit on fire, pretty much. Darkman becomes disfigured and turned into, Peyton Westlake becomes Darkman and disfigured because of being lit on fire. So Nicholas Worth is in both films, which I thought was kind of a little bit sort of an interesting little thing there, especially for, a fan of Darkman. So that was interesting to see that. And I really liked Reggie Batts, who played Jude. This is his first acting performance. He never really acted in anything before. And Wes did a great job directing him. And he was just a kid who was having a good time. He was a big fan of Swamp Thing. And he got the job, and he's one of the reasons why the film has some much needed levity. Because for the most part, Wes took this material rather seriously, which is actually something that was a good idea, but it sometimes could have had a little bit more fun with the concept. But I think the budget held him back because originally the screenplay was much more ambitious, and they were going to do more with it, and then the budget got cut down, so they only had like $3 million to work with. But Wes, he still was able to add much needed levity with the character of Jude, who's this, young black boy who is really has a lot of, fun. Only in the film for a little bit, but he's there enough, and he makes enough an impression that you remember him. I mean, Adrienne Barbeau comes in and meets him first at his gas station, where he's just, basically taking it over for his dad while his dad's gone. And she's like, "Oh no, there goes the neighborhood." And then she goes in, he gives her some shelter. She's trying to get a soda from the soda machine, and it's not working, and she's kicking it. It's like, you can't kick it, you can't do that, you gotta punch it. And then he punches it, and then dispenses a Coke for Adrienne Barbeau. And then I always remember the scene where, actually it was the line he said before was "Oh shit, here comes trouble." But the next one, that's where there goes the neighborhood line, where I remember, because that's when Swamp Thing basically brings him back to life, because Arcane's thugs ended up killing him. And Swamp Thing grabs him and heals him. And he's like, he opens his eyes and he's like, shit, there goes the neighborhood. So I thought that was pretty fun. And so yeah, so most of the performances are really solid. There definitely some pretty big positives for the film. The direction by Wes is great. Does a great job. He really knew how to really try to not show as much of Swamp Thing as possible. He has a lot of shots where you see Swamp Thing from far away, and it works really well, and it makes the shots of Swamp Thing much more effective, because the makeup effects are not that great. They're all right, they're there, but they're nothing that spectacular. The effects by William Munns, they're good for what low budget that they had to work with, but you can tell it's just a guy in a suit. And I definitely do prefer the makeup effects for Swamp Thing in Return of the Swamp Thing any day over the makeup effects of Swamp Thing here, and even including the TV series on USA. I think the makeup is better looking in that as well. And so for the most part, yeah, makeup special effects not the best thing in the world. I mean, there's that weird thing where Arcane mutates and it's some cocoon thing, but it looks like a giant turd. And then the look of Arcane's mutated form, it's alright looking. It's like some lizard thing with like some wild hair, and I don't know. It's okay, but it looks pretty silly, to be honest. And when he gets cut up at the end, he's bleeding. It looks like baby shit. So that's not a really very good thing. And then of course Nicholas Worth, where he turns into when he drinks the formula, and he becomes like a little person. He becomes like a little guy with like a monkey face, and it just looks really lame. Uh, so some of the effects definitely do look really cheap. Some look alright, like the scene where Swamp Thing's arm is cut off and a tendril or something grows out and then grows his arm back. But Swamp Thing looks the best when it's shot from far away, or you do just an up close shot of just the face. Because the face itself wasn't that bad, the makeup effects on the face. It's just the whole body. He wasn't really that great to look at. And it deteriorated like crazy going in the swamp. So that's another problem I had to deal with. As for the story, it's there. It's alright. I mean, I think the film is stronger in terms of its story in the beginning, where it's just building up to the creation of Swamp Thing. And then it just becomes a pretty generic, predictable sort of thriller, really, where Arcane's trying to get a book, the missing book for the formula. He wants a formula for himself. Swamp Thing just runs around and basically just pops up every time Alice, Adrienne Barbeau, needs saving. That's pretty much what happens. And it kicks some ass. Fun scene with these airboats with David Hess and Nicholas Worth, and they're throwing grenades at Swamp Thing, and he ends up like fucking up the airboats. Fun scene where he uses his smarts and intelligence to blow him up, which I like that scene. Scene where he shows up and saves Adrienne Barbeau, and rips apart the truck. Stuff that reminds you of stuff you'd see in the Incredible Hulk TV series with Bill Bixby. Very similar in approach in a lot of ways. And so, yeah, so the story, I think there could be a little bit more action. I mean, it's nice to see Swamp Thing punching people, but punch some more monsters. That's what it's kind of feels like a traditional sci-fi B movie creature feature, but you don't really see the other creature, at least the one that's really a match or for Swamp Thing until the end, and then the battle's just kind of anticlimactic. Swamp Thing picks up a root, smacks Arcane's monster around for a little bit, and then hits him with a sword, and then you don't even see the sword penetrate or anything like that. It's just, and why the hell does Arcane have a sword? I mean, that's just silly shit to see a silly looking monster with a sword and swinging a sword around. Like, I half expected Swamp Thing to find a sword just randomly in the fucking swamp, like the Lady of the Lake would show up, and then Lady of the Swamp would show up and give him a sword, and then he starts sword fighting with the arcane creature. But yeah, a little bit of gunplay here and there. I mean, even the death of David Hess isn't that great. I think it would have been cooler if he took the potion and became a monster, because I think that would be pretty unique to see David Hess actually be a actual monster. I mean, he's played a monster in a lot of films, but he's played a human monster. For them to play an inhuman monster would have been interesting to see, instead of just Nicholas Worf becoming a little small guy with shitty makeup and is really laughable. And I know why they did it, because Nicholas Worf's character is, he's actually small. He's a small on the inside, because the formula ends up enhancing who you really are. So that's, I know what the point is. It just looks ridiculous. And since the film is taking itself seriously for the most part, and it's not like Return of the Swamp Thing where it's just like batshit craziness. Uh, Trevor Locklear talking to plants and shit. We're not even going to try to take this seriously. And so it's just, when you have that seriousness and then you have that, it just really, it's a disconnect. It's a change in tone that I don't really care for that much. And plus the makeup effect is pretty bad. Um, but yeah, for the most part, the story is just, it's there, it's alright. It's stronger in the beginning. It's strong when you have the relationship between Alice and Swamp Thing. The scene where Swamp Thing talks to her in a garden with these flowers and everything is really beautifully shot. And there's a lot of fun, good chemistry between Swamp Thing, between Dick Durock and Adrienne Barbeau. Where the scene was like, "Does it hurt?" And he's like, "Only when I laugh." So it shows that he has a good point of view with the situation that he's in. And the story does a good job. Wes did a good job creating a story that makes you feel for Alec. It makes you feel for Swamp Thing. You have the whole scene where he goes in and he ends up going to he finds like the remains of his lab. It's all burned to a crisp, and then he's trying to see if he can still do his work, but he can't use his hands because he's too strong, and he keeps breaking the glass. So that was a good sequence that showed the tragedy of Swamp Thing and how tragic this character is, and it really did make you feel for him. Much like, of course, you'd feel with Peyton Westlake in Darkman, where he can't really do a lot of his work either because his hands are so messed up. So, so yeah, it's really effective when it comes to those type of sequences, but not as effective when it comes to fun, monster bashing, creature feature action stuff. You can tell that Wes is still, that's not his, let's just say that's not his repertoire, so to speak. It's in his repertoire, but action is not his, it's not what he's good at. And you can tell. But, the action sequences are alright, especially the sequence of the airboat is definitely watchable. The film has a good pacing, it has a good pace to it. I don't think it's really ever boring, so it does keep you engaged and entertained for the most part. It does an adequate job in doing that. And So yeah, and there's other things that I honestly think Harry Manfredini's score is, especially the little piece of music called called Alec and Cable. That's a really beautiful piece of music from the guy who does the scores for Friday the 13th films. And since he did the scores for Friday the 13th movies, he pretty much just copies the scores from Friday the 13th for a lot of scenes in this. So when Swamp Thing is chasing after somebody, it sounds exactly like it does when Jason is or Jason's mom is chasing after somebody. So it just that didn't really work. That's really the closest thing that's really when it comes to horror, when it comes to this movie, is Harry Manfredini's Friday the 13th score. Because this film was surprisingly in Fangoria's 101 Most Unheralded Horror Films list in their book, and that always made me that always took me back. It always took me aback. I was like, wait a second, wasn't really offended or anything. It was surprising. I'm like, I don't really look at Swamp Thing as a horror film. It's a fantasy comic book movie. It's not really a horror movie. And some of the things about it are kind of would be awful and not kind of definitely suck to be turned into Swamp Thing, for instance. But it's not necessarily horrible. I wouldn't say it's horror. That's what I'm saying. It's not really a horrible movie either, but I wouldn't say it's horror. But that's just me personally. It's just my personal opinion. Um, as for anything else that I can come up with that really comes to mind when it comes to this movie is it's pretty quaint. It's pretty quaint and tame. I mean, there's a little bit of violence, nothing too intense. I mean, there's a scene where Swamp Thing supposedly crushes David Hess's head, and it shows a decent amount of blood for a PG movie. But I would have been fine with seeing more. I think the film would have benefited from an R rating, so it's more intense, so it's more violent. I mean, make it more like a horror film. I know Swamp Thing's a DC comic, but it wasn't necessarily a comic for kids. I mean, I remember reading some of the early 70s comics. They weren't necessarily comics for kids. So I think it would have been perfectly okay with the creators of Swamp Thing and with DC if the film was rated R. Um, but yeah, it's an alright movie. I mean, if you saw it, I mean, it's adequately entertaining. It's passable. I just think the fact that it takes itself really seriously at points, at some moments, it's a positive relationship between Alice and Alec as Swamp Thing, and the tragedy of being the Swamp Thing. That all makes sense with the seriousness. But some of the other stuff, it just really didn't need to be taken as seriously as it did. Could have used a little bit more fun. It could have had more monsters. Could have had more fun with the Swamp Thing fighting monsters. Um, but for the most part, it's all right. It's a decent bit of entertainment. As for this Blu-ray, it's a good Blu-ray. Probably the best quality of the film you ever see. So you can really see some of the beautiful nature shots and really pristine high definition glory. I haven't listened to the commentary tracks yet, but the interview with Adrienne Barbeau was interesting. How she talks about how a lot of people still remember her from Swamp Thing, and she was talking about how she hated how her hair looked in the film, and she thought it was going to be terrible because she didn't look good. She's explained why the nudity is not in the American release. She talks about how she had a ring that she really liked, and then it got lost in the swamp, and then three days later, the crew got a hold of some Navy guys, and they found a metal detector, and they found a ring. She talks about that's where I learned about Dick Durock and how he was in 103-degree temperatures with crazy high humidity in the outfit and the suit, and then it tore every time that he did a stunt, and they had to fix it up. So for the most part, Adrienne sounds like it was a pretty tough and rough shoot, but it sounds like she's got a good opinion on it and a good opinion on the film. Uh, the interview with Reggie was nice because you got to see from his point of view and how he really enjoyed being a part of the film and how it was a dream come true for him. It wasn't really a lot of. He talked about how Adrienne was very nice to him. She even took him in personal limo rides, which I think was really nice of her. Dick Durock was really nice as well. Everyone was really nice to him. Ray Wise was nice as well. The kid was very knowledgeable with films, so that's something that the actors were surprised that he knew so much. And so yeah, and then Len Wein, the creator of Swamp Thing, briefly talks about the film. He talks about the creation of the character, which he honestly doesn't even remember honestly how he honestly did it, what happened, how he came up with it. He just remembers it was some sketch he did, and he just randomly called it Swamp Thing, and then it went from there. And he was hired originally as a writer for comics, not as an artist. And so he explained that a little bit. Then he explained a script that Guillermo del Toro was interested in doing, that Joel Silver, the producer, was working on. It was like 2009. It's more based on the Alan Moore comics, which I'm not really the biggest fan of, to be honest. That comics where Swamp Thing is really not Alec Holland. It's a plant creation, plant monster that thinks it's Alec Holland, and existential philosophical mumbo jumbo. I remember being really disappointed by that trade paperback when I checked it out from the library, because I'm a big fan of Swamp Thing, and I read that, and I know everyone was saying it's so great, and I didn't like it. I really like the earlier Swamp Thing comics, and some of the more recent Swamp Thing comics when he got away from Vertigo. I like those comics a lot more than the Alan Moore comics, but that's just my personal opinion. And the movie version was based on the Alan Moore idea, and Len Wein talked about how CGI would be the best way to go, and I disagree with that. I think it should be a combination of the two, of practical and CGI. But yeah, the features are all right. There's nothing with Dick Durock, and sadly he passed away in 2009. May he rest in peace. I always remember him as Swamp Thing. And but there's interviews with him that are available on YouTube from the Swamp Thing TV series release that Shout Factory released, which I've never seen that show, and I'm kind of curious about it. Although it's kind of hard to get, like, because season 1 is easy to find for cheap. Season 2, you might be able to find it for all right price. Season 3, like, it's $35, $50 on Amazon or on Scream Factory or Shout Factory's site. Season 4 is pretty pricey too, so it's 4 seasons, but it's like you only really can get seasons 1 and 2 for a fair price, which is really, honestly, kind of sucky. So that kind of makes me not really that willing, at least anytime soon, to really invest a lot of time or money into the Swamp Thing TV series. And there's photo galleries. They're fun, showing behind the scenes photos from the making of the film and so forth and so on, and the trailer. But features are alright. Nothing spectacular. I haven't listened to the commentary tracks either, so, but I mean, they might really make it a little bit better. But if you're a fan of the film, it's definitely the best version of the film you can get. So I do recommend it. Unless you're really a big fan of the nudity, and you gotta have the nudity. So you gotta have, the nudity's not here. So if you want the nudity, you want the titties, you gotta go get the European version. You gotta go get the out of print rare MGM DVD. Or watch it on TV, I guess, because I guess they aired the nudity version on like FearNet or something, which I think is funny. But anyway, I really don't know what else to say about Swamp Thing, except that it surprised me a little bit watching this again, how much I enjoyed it, how much I had a good time with it. I mean, it's enjoyable to watch, in my opinion, but it's not a great movie. And it's not, I'd say it's alright. It's definitely a mediocre film to me, because I just think there's a lot of things that hold it back. It shifts in tone, where it goes from serious to silly. It goes from campy to dramatic. It tries to have some horror elements, but doesn't ever really go through with it. And disappointing climax, where the monsters fight, and you blink and you miss it fight, which barely lasts any time whatsoever. And So yeah, it's an all right film. I don't think it's one of the worst films ever made based on a comic book. I think in some ways it's a little bit underrated, especially the its influence on serious takes on comic book characters. It's one of the first films to really do that, to take its source material really seriously for the most part. But it was also a detriment to the film because with its source material, with the Swamp Thing running around, it really should have had more fun with itself. I had more fun with the concept. It kind of held back in that regard. I think with a bigger budget, and if Wes is able to do the script that he originally intended on using, then it might have been an even grander and even better and even bigger film. But as it is, it's an alright, tame, quaint little monster movie that you can sit back with a bag of chips and enjoy. It's just definitely a time waster for me. I really don't know what to say except for rate it out of 5 stars, give it 3 out of 5. I just think it's average, decent, passable entertainment. But I'm glad to have it in my collection because there's some decent features on here, and it is a film that I don't mind. It's not a film I hate or anything. It's just a film I find just all right. It's a decent watch. Um, and I do personally prefer Return of the Swamp Thing, which I'll get to soon enough, and you'll hear why I feel that way. But anyway, thank you for watching my review of Swamp Thing, and I will see you guys later. See ya.